Hello and welcome to my show, Science for the Uninitiated. I'm Joshua, your host, and let's get started. So I have a video that's about 5 minutes long. It's about nitric oxide and the production of nitric oxide via the nasal passageway. Within that video, we talk about, briefly, the pathway to initiate nitric oxide production. We're going to dive further into the weeds, and this is going to be a little bit longer of a video. So if you don't have the attention span for this, you can always go back to the original nitric oxide video, which is about 5 minutes long. But in this one, I'm going to be citing the studies that I read. And also, I have a small PowerPoint that I'm going to be reading off to you right now. And without further ado, we have our research paper titled Nasal and Oral Contribution to Inhaled and Exhaled Nitric Oxide, a Study in Tracheotomized Patients. I'm just going to be reading the abstract, okay? Abstract. Nitric oxide is produced at different sites in the human airways and may have several physiological effects. Orally produced NO, nitric oxide, seems to contribute to the levels found in exhaled air. Auto-inhalation of nasal NO increases oxygenation and reduces pulmonary artery pressure in humans. The aim of this study was to measure the concentration and output of NO during nasal, oral, and tracheal controlled exhalation and inhalation. 10 tracheotomized patients and 7 healthy subjects were studied. The mean fraction of exhaled NO from nose, mouth, and trachea was 56 plus or minus 8, 14 plus or minus 4, and 6 plus or minus 1 parts per billion, respectively. During single breath nasal, oral, and tracheal inhalation, the fraction inhaled NO was 64 plus or minus 14, 11 plus or minus 3, and 4 plus or minus 1, respectively. There was a marked flow dependency on nasal nitric oxide output in healthy subjects, which was 4-fold greater at a higher flow rate during inhalation when compared to exhalation. There's a substantial contribution of nasal and oral nitric oxide during both inhalation and exhalation. Nasal nitric oxide output is markedly higher during inhalation, reaching levels similar to those that are found in clinical effects in the trachea. These findings have implications for measurements of nitric oxide in exhaled air and physiological effects of auto-inhaled endogenous nitric oxide. So if you don't know, nitric oxide can be given to you exogenously via intraoral or intravenous administration. So while nitric oxide can be given to you exogenously, the most important thing to be taking away from this abstract is that you can create it going down the nasal pathway, which is what we're going to be diving into right now. Nitric oxide in human performance. A neuromodulator necessary for vasodilation, further driving the parasympathetic state within the human physiology. Theoretically, those who are able to access this state are better off for it. In a sense, they can activate the recovery mechanisms more efficiently than those who cannot. Nitric oxide helps you get into that parasympathetic state, in opposition to being in a sympathetic state where your vascular system is constricted. It would open up and vasodilate when nitric oxide spreads across the body in systemic circulation, which we'll be getting to here shortly. Nitric oxide consequently, individuals who do not have the habitual capacity of effectively initiating the nitric oxide pathway via habitual nasal breathing suffer from the effects of not finding a parasympathetic state to be easily initiated. The oxygen begins free floating in the atmosphere. It is then sucked up via the nasal cavity to begin the initiation down the nasal pathway. So remember what we were talking about before. Oxygen's free floating in the environment. It has to go into your nose, where we then find the paranasal sinuses, which have ducts that dip into the nasal cavity. There, O2 must bypass the paranasal sinuses, which is a part of the necessary exchange for obtaining inducible nitric oxide synthase, INOS, different from endothelial NOS in that it isn't found in the artery lining of by the paranasal sinus. The endothelial nitric oxide synthase, the enzyme necessary for nitric oxide, is not the nitric oxide synthase that we find within the paranasal sinus. Within the paranasal sinus, we have the inducible nitric oxide synthase. These are two different enzymes, one found in the paranasal sinus and the other one found within the artery lining. Next, let's talk about the paranasal sinuses. So we have the frontal sinus, the ethmoid sinus, the maxillary sinus, ethmoid sinus would be in the temples. The maxillary sinus would be in your maxilla. And the sphenoid sinus would be parallel. The sphenoid sinus would be parallel to your temples, in the same way that the ethmoid sinus would be, but they would be in deeper than the ethmoid sinus, from my understanding. Carrying on with the physiological pathway of nasal breathing, O2 travels down the respiratory tract and into the pulmonary capillaries, pulmonary veins, then into the heart, which then takes the O2 and pumped out through the left ventricle, through the aorta, into systemic circulation. Remember, when we pump out of the ventricle, we have to go up the ascending aorta to get our upper limbs and our head, down the descending aorta down the descending aorta tract to then fulfill everything below my upper extremities and down to the tip of my toes. Into systemic circulation, where within the endothelial lining we find the synthesis of nitric oxide, initiated by L-arginine to create nitric oxide, which disperses throughout the rest of the body, dilating the blood vessels. So remember, as soon as you start using those nasal pathways, that nasal pathway, you're initiating the response to then you're initiating the response for nitric oxide synthase to then metabolize and become nitric oxide. So as soon as you start nasal breathing, you're getting into a parasympathetic tone, and your body will begin to rest and digest. So this is very important to understand, especially if you're an athlete. Understanding how to bounce in and out of the sympathetic and parasympathetic states. When you're on your rest period or your rest break and you're laying off of the repetitions, you want to go into as fast and as efficiently as you possibly can into that parasympathetic state where you can take a breather, relax for a second, maybe you have a minute rest interval, maybe you have a 5-minute rest interval. It's important to exercise the ability to get into that resting state and then switch it back on to get back into that sympathetic state and turned back on. But in this way, you're conditioning your body to have the ability to get into a rested state and then bounce out of the resting state somewhat or better, or even better recovered than an individual who didn't choose the nasal pathway to initiate recovery on their rest intervals. I hope you can follow along there. So, why do we want vasodilation? Vasodilation acts in accordance to parasympathetic nervous system. The basic idea with this bodily function is to help our body rest and digest. Vasodilation, remember, it's the widening of blood vessels due to the relaxation of blood vessels in the muscular walls. Anti-inflammatory effects. With vasodilation in effect, white blood cells are properly dispersed. They have an easier time dispersing throughout the entire body in systemic circulation. Remember, if the blood vessels are opened up, there's more space for more blood to run through, and your blood pressure will also not be as high. So for individuals who are trying to find a way to lower their blood pressure, or maybe you find yourself with constant high blood pressure, maybe look into the physiological effect that is initiating nitric oxide and try to implement that into your day-to-day. We're going to get into mouth breathing here in a couple of minutes. Anti-inflammatory effects, and then last but not least, the relaxing vessels are a property also held in the neurovascular spectrum, allowing for adequate oxygen supply to the active neurons. This is also a neuroprotective factor, along with being anti-inflammatory and good for initiating a parasympathetic response. And if you go ahead and you look at my Substack, and if you log on to my Substack and give some of my articles a read, you can definitely find the nitric oxide post that I made, and you can look at all the graphs that I have. Everything's cited already. You can click the links. You can copy and paste the cited source material and go read the actual studies for yourself if that's something that you're interested in. That's completely up to you. You don't have to do that, and you can just watch these videos. That's completely fine as well. So next, and to pretty much wrap up this video in the conclusion, the dangers of completely bypassing the nasal passageway. When electing to mouth breathe over nasal, besides foregoing adequate nitric oxide production, the body will physiologically obstruct that pathway and create adaptations to optimize for mouth breathing. Mouth breathing in the past has been used as a derogatory term, and we're not using it as a derogatory term now. But it is a good term to use as a proxy for saying that somebody doesn't look too bright or was developmentally handicapped. Now, why is that? I think we can conclude that mouth breathing is not inherently effective. And if it's not effective, it's not healthy. And if it's not healthy, then it's not attractive. Attractiveness and health are usually interconnected. In the case for someone who opts to habitually mouth breathe over the course of many years, especially during the developmental time period, the skull and cervical spine will adapt to give an individual an adenoidal face. An adenoidal face is a face that is long and it is short. That's what Mike Mew says. We have talked about Mike Mew in mewing and correct oral posture in a video that I posted a couple of months ago. You're more than welcome to look at that video as well. And over the course of somebody's life, the skull will start to elongate, like we said, and it'll get shorter, and it'll get thinner. And when this happens, the nasal passageway also begins to close on itself. And you'll see that in the side profile, the nose will start to droop, strangely enough. This is adding as an obstruction from keeping people from from keeping people from nasal breathing effectively. So, what an individual will usually do, and this is very common when you have an individual who is knocked unconscious and he's laying on his back and maybe he's not breathing properly, and to administer, or he's not breathing and he has no pulse, and you have to administer oxygen to this individual, whether it's by CPR or you're gonna use a blowing device and to get air into his face. When this person is laying down, you have to creep their neck up like this. And then you can start administering oxygen, because that's going to hang the mouth open, creating a passageway for air to come into the mouth. And if I walked around like this with my neck up in the air, with my head and neck up in the air, with my neck creaked back, like so, then I can breathe more effectively through my mouth. That is not what we want to do. Not at all. But that's the adaptation that people will make with their face. And this is something that you'll be able to recognize yourself once you look at the photos that I posted on my Substack. And we're going to dive a little bit more into this precautionary tale. The fact that your body should follow the most effective pathway in physiological speak, the implications could cause permanent damage that is not aesthetically suitable for a person. So, if you're into vanity, if you're into vanity metrics and you're into aesthetics, you know that an individual who is hanging his mouth open and breathing through his mouth is not somebody that you find particularly attractive, usually. Now, there are exceptions to these rules and whatnot, but that is the end of the video. And I want to thank you for taking an interest in watching this. If you took it to the entirety of this 17 minutes and so far 45 seconds, then thank you. I hope you have a good time.